The Russian Civil War is an event above all wars, in its barbarity, cruelty, and anarchic nature. Contrary to popular belief, the war wasn't simply fought between two sides, the traditional communist versus anti-communist storyline. It really encompassed much more than that, with a range of factions and revolutionary movements taking advantage of the sudden collapse of order throughout the country. It is in my opinion that this is one of the most complex conflicts in world history, even exceeding the decentralized nature of the current Syrian civil war. In the latter, you have a complexity of belligerents, however you also have well-defined coalitions like the Free Syrian Army. In the Russian Civil War, the idea of well-defined coalitions is superfluous at best, being that you had military leaders that constantly changed allegiances from day to day. They would then attempt to set up microstates with incredibly short lifespans across the vast swathes of Russia. However, to better understand the full range of the conflict, we must begin at its roots with the rise of the Russian Provisional Government. During World War I, the Russian Empire suffered tremendous loss of life with millions of military casualties, and by early 1917 was on the verge of collapse. This, in combination with food shortages, would propel the country into revolution, which replaced the Tsarist regime with a liberal provisional government headed by the State Duma. From the onset, the provisional government suffered from a lack of legitimacy, as Tsar Nicholas II had dissolved the State Duma before his abdication on the 15th of March 1917. Vladimir Lenin, the Bolshevik leader, had also returned from exile in April of that year, further producing an ideological rift in the fragile state. By July, Alexander Kerensky had become the new minister of the provisional government, having to deal with a dramatic increase in riots and strikes. With political efficacy draining from continued participation in the World War, 2 all-Russian Muslim congresses were held to discuss issues of nationality among the Muslim minorities, the first being held in Moscow and the second being held in Kazan. At the same time, the Kazakh Alish Orda was founded, laying the seeds of dissent in Central Asia. In the Caucasus, the situation was equally as perilous, with the formation of the Union of the Mountain People, calling for increased autonomy for the region. Although a multi-ethnic coalition government was formed, this had quickly broken down by late October. The fiery rhetoric of nationalism and revolution further swept Russia into disarray, and when given the opportunity, the Bolsheviks took their chance and launched a coup against the provisional government. Although the initial uprising took place in Petrograd, Bolshevik forces were actually able to secure the city of Tashkent before Petrograd fell. In turn, the Autonomous Republic of Kokand was formed, which directly opposed Bolshevik rule. To solidify their legitimacy, the Bolsheviks ran elections in the Constituent Assembly. They backfired. They lost by a wide margin to the Socialist Revolutionaries, and as a result, this created a wide rift between Bolshevik socialist ideology and present reality. At this point, civil war was on the horizon, with the socialist Bolsheviks on one side and the monarchist whites in the other. Much further to the west, a Ukrainian People's Republic was formed called the Rada. The neighboring Baltic states were also flaring up in increasingly deadly skirmishes, like in the Estonian capital of Tallinn. These developments gave the Bolsheviks the incentive to begin advances into Ukraine and the Baltic, knowing that many peasants in Livonia had actually supported the Bolsheviks in the previous November elections. For Ukraine, this was hardly the case, as it had more nationalistic ideology. In response to the nationalist developments in the western portions of the old Russian Empire, Finland declared independence. A brutal civil war lasted for 3 months, in which the country was divided into the Bolshevik-backed south and the white-backed north. Eventually, however, the Russian Bolsheviks distanced themselves from their Finnish allies by recognizing Finnish independence by the end of December. The Russian Bolsheviks also managed to dismantle the Belarusian National Congress, given that Belarusia provided some of the most widespread support to them. Elsewhere, the situation was not looking good for the Reds. Even with the support among the peasantry, the Bolsheviks had to deal with the reality of Lithuanian independence, which was sponsored by the German Empire. In Central Asia, the Alash autonomy was founded, siding with the Orenburg Cossacks and White forces. The three-way competition between the Alash, Kokand, and Tashkent Soviet would evidently lead to extreme polarization, more so than many other parts of Russia. The friction between Russian settlers and the local peasants would only flare up into ethnic violence that could only be rivaled by the widespread massacres in the Caucasus. In the Caucasian port city of Baku, for example, local Muslims began to set up self-defense organizations during a revolt. Just to the west, the Ossetian National Council decided to side with the Bolsheviks. Their political proximity to the Reds could very well explain the hostility they encountered from the Democratic Republic of Georgia later on. By the new year, Red Guard units formed in Baku. The Muslim Musavat party decided to side with the Armenian Dashnak party and formed the Baku Commune. Unlike with the concept of vanguardism, communes were often sporadic and lacked concrete governmental structures, thus acting as direct democracies. Russia was slowly falling apart, and the Bolsheviks simply had no idea how to cope with the situation. They were still recovering from their electoral blunder in November and were still at war with the Central Powers. Lenin desperately wanted a peace deal with the Germans, but was ferociously rebuked by his fellow party members. In response to the chaos, the Whites under Generals Kornilov and Alexeyev formed the Volunteer Army, which was originally strengthened at 3,000 men. Situated in the Don region, the army found an ally in the Don Cossacks, although this would later dissolve as the war progressed. At the same time, Armenia and Latvia declared independence. Entente soldiers also started to pour into Murmansk, Arkhangelsk, and Vladivostok, with further British troops in Central Asia and the Caucasus. And to make matters worse, a Transcaucasian Federation was formed, although it didn't secede. The situation for the Whites was further deteriorated by the Ice March, a retreat staged during the dead of winter from the city of Rostov all the way to the Kuban. Here, they sought further Cossack support against the Reds. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, the Bolsheviks had just captured Kiev and were in the process of restructuring their armed forces. This was accomplished when on the 23rd of February 1918, they created the Red Army. It was the case that the White cause was surviving on the whims of German support. The failure of peace talks between Germany and the Bolshevik government also further facilitated White support in Baltic independence, allowing the Germans to occupy Latvia and push into Estonia. To give a scope of the German advance, the Estonian government had only declared independence the day before German forces arrived in Tallinn. In Kokand, the local Soviet was having difficulty in fighting the Republic. It was only when Tashkent Soviet reinforcements arrived that the Kokand autonomy succumbed.